to today's Energy Central Power session entitled Maximizing the Value of Utility Data to Drive Clean Energy Initiatives. Get ready for state regulators to require this of all electric service providers. Before we begin, we'd like to extend a special thanks to the sponsor of today's event, West Monroe. West Monroe is a digital services firm that partners with utilities to address industry issues across operations, technology, regulatory, and executive functions, including grid modernization, electrification, decarbonization, integrating DERs, telecommunication, and delivering on the customer promise. Thank you, West Monroe, for sponsoring today's event. And I'm very happy to turn the floor over to our moderator for today's event, Paul Dakotas, Senior Partner with West Monroe, to kick things off. Paul, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us today to discuss how to go about maximizing the use of utility and customer data to drive clean energy initiatives. As many of you know, the utility industry is being encouraged by regulators and third parties to provide access to utility and customer data, building on previous initiatives following the rollout of AMI meters and smart controls and sensors on the utility grid. This is how this all happened. So much more data is now being collected, and now it's a question of getting it to market and having it being used. Several regulatory commissions are examining the implications of making utility and customer data more accessible to third parties and customers, with some states broadening the data pool to include more than just customer-metered end-use data. National and state initiatives to democratize data have had mixed reviews from what we see, from complete abandonment to growing adoption. And if we could flip to the next slide. The movement to democratize data began with the proliferation of smart meters under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act era in 2009. Included in the act was a mandate that utilities collect and make customer meter data available to third parties. Modeled after the Blue Button Initiative, which is a national movement enabling consumers to have access to their own health information, the Obama administration's Green Button Initiative was designed to empower customers to make more informed energy decisions regarding their own energy use. Proponents of Green Button Initiative believe that greater access to customer data would motivate better energy decisions and spur market innovations in energy efficiency, demand response, and other grid technologies and practices. For numerous reasons, Green Button Connect fell a bit short of achieving widespread adoption. Today, regulators are viewing utility and customer data through a modern lens and closely examining states like Texas, California, and now New York on how they have or are addressing utility data democratization. In addition, digital platforms and products are available today that did not previously exist in their current form that can facilitate the collection, analysis, and reporting of utility and customer data. We can flip to the next slide. As shown in the slide, we highlight 3 states as examples. Texas, for example, has built a central meter data repository where all utilities are required to post their smart meter data. Called Smart Meter Texas, this makes it easy for customers and competitive service providers to gain access to near real-time customer meter data, rather than having to petition both the utility and the customer for the same data that exists in the portal. California organized their utilities to collectively standardize customer data and make it available at the utility level, rather than through a statewide portal like in Texas. Each utility makes smart meter data available and follows the same procedures statewide for data access, data definition, and data portability. Where California differs from Texas is in the addition of distributed energy resource data for market developers. New York, while trailing a bit behind Texas and California, is taking a different approach, operating under the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act of 2019, which is designed to support and jumpstart new clean energy initiatives and the role that utility and customer data plays. With access to integrated customer data and utility energy system data, including distributed energy resources, in one portal, regulators in New York anticipate greater ease and efficiencies in accelerating the deployment of clean energy solutions across the state. The goals are to attract investment, enable sophisticated analytics, identify operational efficiencies, and promote innovation and encourage new business models in the industry, which in turn is expected to create value for customers in the state's energy system. New York is first to push forward a comprehensive integrated data approach. We are fortunate today to have 4 industry leaders with us, all who have a role and a part to play in this data democratization. We have 2 from utilities, 1 regulator, and 1 solution provider to give us a perspective from each person. So to start this webinar and turning it over to panelists, we agreed that each panelist would provide a brief background and introduction to themselves, as opposed to me simply reading a bio. And they will offer their comments and perspective. I think putting this in their context so that we understand where they're coming from will certainly be helpful. If you do have questions following something you hear from any of the panelists, please put it in the chat and we'll be sure to get to those. So these introductions will be brief. We then have a series of questions that I could lead the discussion with. We did discuss this as a panel, that the panelists as well have a right to ask each other questions. We really truly want this to be an open dialogue. So if Mark says something and Marco wants to challenge it, we will do that to make the most out of this webinar. And again, once we finish the introductions, I could kick it off with a series of questions. So with this, we'll go in this order for the brief introductions and opening comment, which I hope will be somewhat stimulating and provocative and insightful. We'll start with Mark, then we'll move on to Aram, then on to Marco, and we'll end with Damien. So let's kick it off. Mark, you're up.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you for those that are participating remotely to hear and participate in this panel. So my name is Marcus Guerra, as Paul mentioned. I'm currently the Director of Distribution System Planning and Strategy at Southern California Edison. I've been in the utility space over 25 years. A good portion of my focus has been in the transmission and distribution system planning. So my perspectives come from how we plan and shape the grid to meet some of these future demands. Some of the things that you heard mentioned in California, we've been focusing a lot on the integration of distributed energy resources. And so some of the things that I'm really proud of, the work that I've done here, and not only at Southern California Edison, but I've also had a significant amount of time working in the Northern California utility, Pacific Gas Electric, is streamlining interconnections and really working towards adding more distributed energy resources integrated in a way. Some of the things that we've done in that space is really sharing more information about our grid, particularly where and when there is going to be hosting capacity. I think we're continually learning and evolving in that space and sharing that information. And I see that trend even further evolving as we start to focus on other electrification activities, such as the growth of transportation electrification, building electrification. We see a similar evolution going to happen also on that side, on how we could better share utility data, but at the same time, also understand what some of the electrificated loads are going to look like. We're looking to try to gather information from fleet operators, other developers in that space, where how we could further expand our ability to meet some of these decarbonization goals. Other things that I'm focused on here that I think is relevant is not only about what's our grid able to host, but also areas or opportunities in the grid where other resources may be of helpful. And so we also have a program that we've developed that we share annually on the 3 California utilities on where their grid needs are on the distribution side. And so it's also another way of being able to share some information about where we need the most help on our grid and to understand would it be a viable option. So we do also have a grid needs assessment, and what we also call where are the distribution deferral opportunities. So the other areas that I think would be very helpful, and this started with some of our wildfire activities, is also looking at opportunities where it maybe makes sense for a microgrid. So there's work that's been done to share information from a grid resilience perspective, from a microgrid opportunity. And that gets into like the future of planning, where there'll be a lot more integration all the way across, working with our communities and sharing, information about what work we have underway and how we can incorporate the community's needs into our overall planning. So with that there, I'd like to hand it off to Aram.
Thank you, Mark. Aram Shumavan, I'm the founder and CEO of Kavala. We are a solutions provider in this space, based nominally in California, but with employees scattered across the entire country and in Europe as well. So a little bit of background on me. I like to refer to myself as a recovering regulator. I worked at the California Public Utilities Commission for a little bit over a decade, mostly on market design issues, especially interface with long-term procurement planning with the investor-owned utilities and interfacing with the single state ISO, the California Independent System Operator here in California. Kavala provides a pretty broad spectrum of services on top of the platform that is sort of core to all of our offerings, but that includes a lot of integrated grid planning, evaluation and support work, both for utilities and for regulators. And we deal with very large volumes of data, and really excited to be able to talk more about sort of the implications of all of this. And I want to point out, we are sort of uniquely positioned in that we understand the needs of the utilities, the challenges that utilities have integrating these data sets and making them appropriately available, and also the needs of the regulator in the same equation, and trying to balance a broad spectrum of issues, including customer privacy, but also leveraging the value and access to interval meter data, and also understanding more about how it is that end users of electric services can both advantage themselves and their businesses, but also provide a growing list of services to the utilities, and under FERC Order 2222, increasingly to the bulk power system as well. So I want to point out a couple of things here just to kick things off in general. First of all, I want to make sure that people understand that there is no right answer here. There are different approaches, as Paul correctly pointed out here, state to state, and in fact, utility to utility, because frequently the systems that are in place are unique to the individual utility. And that means that you may often end up in a situation where what works for one utility, even in the same jurisdiction, will not work for another. So it's important to keep that in mind. I will say that, and I suspect we will be talking more about this, there are a lot of important issues that will be coming up around access to data, especially around the concept of personally identifiable information, critical energy infrastructure information, and market sensitive data. And all of these things need to be considered in a coordinated way, or there is a risk that the goals, no matter how lofty they may be, either from a utility or from their regulator, may not be able to be achieved. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, and I will attempt to play both a partner and a foil to both sides of the equation here, from the regulator perspective and the utility perspective, because that's in fact where we sit in the organization.
Thanks, Aaron.
And Mark?
My turn, right?
Yes.
So first, I want to thank Paul for having me part of this panel, and also thank all the participants. I really look forward to the interaction and Q&A. I think that really will make the panel and information transfer pretty exciting and valuable. My name is Marco Padula, and I'm the director of the Office of Markets and Innovation at the New York State Department of Public Service. I've been with the commission for just over 29 years. The Office of Markets and Innovation is responsible for pretty much everything clean energy related to the state's clean energy goals, from large scale to distributed solar to storage to transportation electrification, building electrification, EE, both at NYSERDA and the utilities. So I tried to reflect back as to the first time when we actually started thinking about the need for data. And it brought me back to what we called our REV proceeding, the renewing the energy vision, back in 2014, where we really recognized that distributed resources are going to come at us gung-ho. And utilities, they really have to start getting ready for those coming into the system and how they're going to be integrated into the electric system. And we required utilities to think about that in the form of what we call distributed system implementation plans. We challenge utilities, think really hard about all the things you need to do to integrate distributed resources, and also get information out there to the public. And that really focused on system information, things like hosting capacity, for example. And the push was get those filings periodically. They would be updated, they would be out there, made public, so that the market could respond accordingly. Those were kind of real static filings, I would call them. And as we progressed from 2014 and the subsequent years that followed, we started having to develop other programs, like a distributed solar program that grew from 3,000 to 6,000 megawatts, significant energy efficiency programs, significant electrification programs, and also a very significant storage roadmap and goal. And it was really in the development of the storage roadmap, which I was directly involved in, and the staff team, thought about how can we enable storage developers to really scale storage in New York? What information do they need? How can they decide where peak loads may be a problem on the system and a storage facility could really help? And we developed this concept of getting multiple types of data, putting them in one place, and having databases in one place to then be able to query that database and find relationships across those databases. So not just taking customer usage data and looking at trends of customer usage, but having customer usage data in addition to demographic data, building envelope data, property value data, weather data, and finding relationships between those things and really extracting what I call information. Data by itself doesn't really give you information. You have to extract that in terms of a trend or a relationship between the two. So that's the punchline I want to end my introduction with, that I really think that the relationship between databases and data elements is really where the value is, and that what we're embarking on in New York really attempts to do that. So now it's one way, like Arun was saying. There could be other ways to go about it, but I really wanted to put a spotlight on the fact that it's multiple databases and extracting the real information from having those all in one place, that if you have them separate and you don't have access to them, there's no way to extract that type of information. So with that, I'll pass it over to Damien.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Marco. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk about this very exciting topic. My background is I've got 33 years in the electric industry, almost every bit of it at Con Edison, but I did spend about 3.5 years doing cogen development. And I'd say I'm broad on the utility stuff, in particular from the power plant to the transmission to the distribution system, and then the engineering and operations. So from that, you can see I'm not an IT expert at all. I like to joke that I do play one on TV, and I'm glad I'm not there in person. I'll hear you groan at that bad joke. But I make that joke because it shows that the things we're trying to do, and that I think Marco articulated really well, require like the business understanding piece and then the IT people to make sure that you're getting the right data and to the right places. So obviously we've got a tremendous support team there, and that relationship has actually existed for several decades. You know, at Con Edison, we're starting to think of it like we have 4 commodities. You know, we've always done electric, gas, and steam, and now IT is kind of one of those commodities. And I will admit, a lot of that was inward facing within the different parts internally, and I'll tell you why utility engineers have loved data forever. But I think what's really revolutionary here is that we're being asked to do it externally. So this will be a commodity not just that we use internally, but externally as well, and for all the reasons that were expressed very, very well by my fellow panelists. You know, so I realize this comes off almost a little defensive, but I wanted to stress that, you know, utility engineers have a long history of loving data. And if you know engineers, you know we like to get into the weeds, right? And I think even of my own personal history, you know, the power plants I started out in, even in the late 80s, had just a tremendous amount of SCADA and information. You know, you had a monitor on every bearing, on every big rotating machine. You knew the oil that was going to it, you knew the pressure of everything, et cetera, and so on, because we could control that, right? It was in this tight little area. You know, and the substations were the same way. And then as you started to get closer and closer to the customer, you started to have less and less information, right? Right down to the customer where you had the least amount of information, because you're just getting a bill reading once a month if you're lucky, and maybe you're even have to estimate it and stuff. And so, you know, within that framework, I want to just illustrate we're very passionate about getting as much SCADA everywhere we can. We've made the most of data points, and there's like over 40,000 of them on our network transformers. But now with our new AMI initiative, and a lot of the other utilities are doing that, all of a sudden we're going to add 3.3 million points to that. So the engineers are super excited about it. We kind of want to keep that to ourselves, in the sense that we want to start working through it and building on it. But obviously that doesn't make sense, you know. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we can bring more and more minds to bear on that and that whole meter thing. And that's, again, that's the real revolution, right? We've known a lot about this part of the system upstream so much, but now we're going to know much, much, much more about this. And Mark, I think you said it, you know, and it's not just going to help customers with how they use energy today, but now with all these electrification opportunities they have for transportation and for heating in particular. So just home run across the board. Just feel like I got to fly that banner that we're on board with that, and we want to share it. We feel that our AMI and GIS investments that we've made over the past few years dramatically help that, and we see, you know, the rest of the data and things like that benefiting from that. And we think that the use cases that were already mentioned, like hosting capacity maps and interconnection, have at least been helped towards reaching some of those goals Marco laid out. You know, New York State's on target for 6 gigawatts of solar by 2025, and they're looking for 10 gigawatts by 2030. So I think there's a huge case for that. And you won't be surprised that some of what I'll talk about is privacy and cybersecurity. You know, I think about this as a spectrum. You know, if you have customer data, it's an individual customer. It's obviously very specific data to them. If you start aggregating those customers up to a neighborhood, you could see where that data will help inform community DG. If you get all of those customers on a feeder, you can see where it starts to blend into system data, and then an area substation, and then a transmission substation. And then what I find interesting is on both ends of those spectrums, there's the privacy issue on the customer side, and then there's the critical energy infrastructure when you get a lot of data that could affect a lot of customers at once. So we're always very cognizant of that. We think it's completely manageable, but it's just always got to be paramount to our efforts. So you're not going to be surprised to hear me say that. And then just a few more opening remarks. You know, when people say, like, I think we all agree with these concepts that you know, the customer owns their data. Like, I think everyone pretty much agrees with that. But the interpretations are so interesting. And I think, Harm, I think it was you that talked about the no right answer. You know, I'd say along those lines, there's also this tremendous amount of gray. And as to what that plays out to. And sometimes when people are saying the customer owns the data, what they're sort of saying is we know what the customer wants, and I think we all got to be careful with that. So there's the whole customer consent, there's masking, and again, all of this completely addressable, just trying to kind of frame out the way I see it, color the conversation. And so in summary, excited about energy future, looking forward to this, and very much helping not just the clean energy goals, right? But Marco, I know this is going to resonate with you, but if we do this right, we don't even know what's going to come out of this, right? We're going to share this data and somebody's going to use it in an innovative way we never even thought of, so super exciting to be a part of that and see how that plays out. Thanks.
Thank you all. I just want to remind our audience that we're focused here on the use of data, utility and customer data to advance some of the state and regulatory goals for clean energy and decarbonization. So be that as it may. We can't forget the fact that two of the primary purposes of the utility and one of their goals are safety and reliability. So I just don't want us to lose that as we talk about data and accessibility of data to whoever wants it. One question to kick this off. What do you see, and this is in any particular order, whoever wants to go first can go first, and if you want to challenge somebody's answer, that's fine. When you think about the macroeconomic and the technology trends that are driving the need for greater access to utility and customer data, what are those trends? Why at this point in time are we now focused on this? What are there economic conditions? Are there technology trends that we're seeing that are really forcing this issue? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the market design economist in me wants to go first on this one. So
That's great.
I'll just point out a couple of things here. I think first of all, it's really important to understand that we are at a point where the technologies that enable what I refer to as intermediation of retail rates, all of them are proliferating. Those cost curves are all declining precisely at the moment that the increase in demand on the system is likely to increase the overall cost of the system. Now, we're in the process of electrifying a great deal of the economy, almost all of it, and so it's totally reasonable for costs to go up. The system will have to get larger in order to accommodate all of that. And yet, at the address specific level, at the individual customer level, there is increasing opportunity to be able to self-supply as part of that approach to that transition. So that's a real major driver, and I think it's important to think about this from the end-use customer's perspective. If you convert from internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, as an example, your electric bill is likely to go up quite a bit. And one of the first things that you're going to look at is like, well, is there something I can do about that? You might not even consider the fact that you're not spending any money at the gas pump anymore. But that first reaction is going to be, what can I do about this? Now, it's important to understand that a lot of the things that end use customer can do actually can also provide a significant amount of benefit to the utility and to the bulk power system. For quarter 2222 is actually part of that equation, right? Being able to participate from the end use device directly into wholesale markets through aggregators is a big piece of this. So I think that's a really important thing, but at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that the utility's lack of control over those devices, and it may not be total lack of control, they still need to interconnect, and there's expectations for how they need to behave safely and reliably, but that complicates significantly the process of planning. At the same time, we are moving into a period where instead of a deferral framework where load has been flat or declining, we are now moving into a capacity expansion framework. And all of those things are, for all of the obvious reasons, happening at the exact same time. We're trying to navigate the complexity of all these issues.
And I'll jump in too on that. Very similar to kind of the perspective that Aaron brings up, but from the system planning perspective, definitely from what I'm seeing in terms of trends, major growth in the transportation electrification sector. We have customers coming in and looking for interconnection with fairly substantial amount of loads that we typically don't see very often, and we're starting to see that. And we're sharing kind of the timelines. If there's not available capacity, how long it would take to build, and those timelines exceed really the timelines of what the developer's trying to come online, which now brings into question, well, what can we do? What data is available that we can share to help enable this? And some of the things that we're definitely really looking at, and this is where the data share would be important, is the concept of load management. And with high amounts of transportation electrification, how the utility could help orchestrate some of that load management, working with these fleet operators. But it's going to happen with the being able to kind of share the data about what's happening behind the meter as well as what's happening on front of the meter. And so from where I'm at, that's kind of one of the bigger use cases that I'm seeing really popping up. And then tied to that is the integration of the other distributed energy resources and how they could play a role in helping manage some of the reliability concerns or grid constraints that the grid may experience. So that's what some of the things I'm living in right now.
Yeah, at the risk of being repetitive, yeah, I think, it's also too recognizing that in other industries, this has been tremendous. The data has really helped a lot of things. I think of my GPS and not ever having to open up a map, so even just something simple and static like that. I think Aram and Mark hit the beauty of, there's going to be a market pull for things like EVs and storage. And then there's going to be somewhat of a regulatory push, maybe, for some of the other stuff. And you need data to quantify all of that. And then maybe the one other piece that I didn't hear mentioned in there is, I think there's, like targeted programs for lower to middle income customers or ESJ areas and things like that. So that will help policymakers evaluate when they do start turning some of these dials, how they're affecting, vulnerable customers versus everybody, et cetera, and so on. So I think there's just an overwhelming amount of reasons. There's other industry examples, and then there's just a whole slew of beneficiaries.
Thank you all.
It's okay. I want to add one point that I feel like forgotten to mention earlier, and that is when we look at the end use customer whose load is changing, it's important to understand that's not an average customer. You could describe, on average, a customer will adopt an average sized PV system, right? But the customer that adopts a PV system before they adopt an electric vehicle is going to have a very different PV system than the PV system they adopt after they get one. They also happen to have adopted a technology, which is a giant battery on wheels, that could itself be a battery that is providing grid services. And so all of these things mean that there is more dynamism. The periods of time over which these adoptions occur becomes complicated, and the demand net of self-supply becomes more complicated. And that's actually creating a trend, which we're seeing broadly now, where the time periods where distributed resources might be able to provide services versus will be necessary to provide services before transmission can actually address needs at the bulk power system level is going to be incredibly important. So in California, the work we're doing for the California Public Utilities Commission is looking at what happens in 2025, which is still very much within the realm of the distribution planning horizon traditionally, versus 2030, which is sort of outside of that time horizon, but before transmission can bring solutions to the table, versus 2035, where you can now start to address these issues with transmission needs. And it's important to look at multiple time horizons when we're thinking about these things and understanding the different paths to whatever that future state might be along that way.
Thank you, Aaron, for the clarification. A question on, this came up earlier regarding personally identifiable information. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how customers can be assured that their data will be protected. But corollary to that is, I remember when I was leading statewide energy emergency planning in the state of New York, and after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security identified critical energy infrastructure that even if you went on a Google Earth, you can't see it. It's blocked out. How should this data, how can it be protected? Say critical infrastructure data. We've got people shooting guns at distribution substations to knock out power. We've got power plants tied to the grid. We've got large transmission stations, et cetera. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. How do we ensure open access to data that can be actionable for market players, but also make sure that the sensitive data is protected? Interested in your thoughts.
I mean, I'll volunteer to go first because I know I brought it up. So I think one, we definitely can. It's just got to be built in as like a guiding principle of all the things we do going forward. So, you know, and this is going to sound like a non-answer, but you know, like privacy, just giving an account number does not, that's really not PII in and of itself, but giving an account number with a customer name, now you're getting pretty close to PI. Throwing in a social security or an address. So there's a little bit of that stackability. And then that gives us a lot of play in terms of masking data and doing anonymous things. So, you know, if you think about when you fill out your taxes, you know, I know at the, I'm an engineer, I like to get in the details. I do that myself. You know, at the end, it tells me, oh, people like you tend to have this much and this much category and this much, you know, they're not giving me those people's individual data. They're doing a nice job of masking. So I think that's one of the ways that's not usually mentioned, but that would satisfy a lot of some of the government's desire to understand how things are playing out and evaluate stuff. And then when you do get to the specific data, you get that customer consent, and the green button connect is one of the ways of dealing with that, Paul, that you mentioned. You know, the CEII falls under the same categories. You know, it's like we're very careful not to define everything as CEII, because if everything's important, nothing's important. You know, so we tend to focus on like energy management systems. EMS system is the buzzword for the SCADA systems we control the system with. But again, to the same point, when you start showing substations and who they feed and where they're located and stuff like that, it all adds up. And it's a spectrum. That's the only other point I want to make. You know, everything here is gray. If you're a super sophisticated actor with a whole government behind you, and you've got 6 months to a year, sure, you're going to find those maps. You know, even if you're not so sophisticated, the substations, you know, even if you're not so sophisticated, you might do a quick Google Earth search. But, you know, the utilities are trying more and more to mask those things. And we certainly don't want to make it as easy as possible. We're certainly at least trying to do common sense things. So I think completely work around. It's just got to be in the mindset. It's the same way we think about safety. It's just got to be in the mindset. You know, it's got to be like one of the first things we think about at every meeting. It's got to be built into every procedure. And then there's got to be a governance process, you know, to learn, right? Because that area is evolving the quickest. So yeah, completely manageable, but must be front and center from our perspective.
And you mentioned, Damien, the principle. I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just kind of building off what Damien mentioned too. I mean, I do think that there's ways that we you know, that we're taking some approaches here, but I do feel that's the dichotomy that we're in, the tension that we're in, is, you know, share as much data as we can, but how do you protect it from the bad actors? And I think that's something that is really challenging. We've tried things such as like, well, some data is available, but who's getting the data, like really having a system to record who they are and kind of vet out that. I think it's a challenging part that we're going to have to continue to think about as far as we, you know, start to advance. And, you know, I think that's some of the concerns that utilities have, is not only making that data available, but how do you protect it? You know, what are the right levels of aggregation? If it's too aggregated, it's not going to be too helpful for folks trying to help drive solutions, but it maybe does a better job of protecting, you know, some of the areas. I know we've also looked at trying to maybe not show some of the areas that are more sensitive to the grid, but all that does is just sort of puts a target on those areas that are blocked out, like, hey, there must be something there. So I agree. It's one of the challenges that we're going to have to continue to manage, and you know, definitely would love to hear perspectives from others on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and Damien, from a utilities perspective. Marco, I'm going to pick on you from a regulator's perspective.
Yeah,
How
chime in
You
on this.
figured that you knew that was coming, right? So, and then maybe Marco, after you address it, Aram, you have the benefit of having been a regulator as well as a provider, service solution provider. So after Marco gives his, if you wouldn't mind giving both of those perspectives for us, Aram, I think that would be helpful.
So, I would just say that from a regulator perspective, we are, 100% aware of the fact that there's critical infrastructure data that needs to be protected. There's customer privacy that needs to be protected. And the way that I think we've trying to approach it is that a lot of the information to be gotten from the IEDR doesn't necessarily require the entity that's looking for that information to get the underlying data. The platform is going to enable the queries and analytics that will enable you to get some really, really valuable information. For example, if energy service entity would like to know, maybe by zip code, where is there enough headroom to put an EV charger, and at the same time want to know how many EVs are registered in this zip code, without ever getting where the substation is or what that critical infrastructure data, the underlying data is, the information itself will be able to be extracted without ever knowing the customer or wanting the customer data. And maybe if the actual customer data is ultimately wanted, we are developing processes to enable that entity to get consent from that customer. If consent isn't gotten, you're not going to get that customer data. And actually, the other point is we would never put personally identifiable information on the platform. There's no need for social security numbers. There's just no need for that, in what we've envisioned. So we're cognizant of the fact that those risks exist, but we feel that there are ways to overcome them with still maintaining the protection and privacy for sure.
Yeah, and I would even chime in, if you read the New York orders, they specifically specify that in addition to everything Marco just said, there's going to be a data ready certification process for people that do access the data, and then there'll be tranches of which, and the buzzword is energy serving entity, can get what data too. So there's going to be all sorts of checks and front end things like that also.
I think there are a couple of things here that are maybe not as apparent as they might be to even people who have familiarity with this as subject area. So I just want to flag a couple of things, especially around personally identifiable information, because we have such a strong history of appreciation for privacy in this country. So one thing that's, I think, really important to point out is anonymization is not the same thing as privacy preservation, right? There are very large amounts of data that are out there that can be interpolated through to re-identify something that has been de-identified through anonymization. And I want to flag that certainly a customer account number or a social security number, these might be considered personally identifiable information or things worthy of preserving privacy around. But I would actually argue that the individual switching events are actually private, right? And that's not necessarily in statute anywhere. It's not usually in the definition of what personally identifiable information is. But when we think about the concept of being able to re-identify something that has been de-identified, we've seen many examples of very large data releases that have been anonymized in some way, allowing for this re-identification. So as an example, when you plug in a level 2 charger, it's very easy to see that for the vast majority of smart meter records because of the relative size of that charging event and the nature of its duration and the like. If you were to own the vehicle not own the vehicle, but be the OEM as an example. Even if you had stripped the customer location or the customer ID from that, you would see and recognize the time periods where those charging events occurred, right? And you would say, oh, we sold this car, we are tracking when it charges, and therefore we know all of this person's energy consumption data. And so it's important to understand that there are much more complicated potential uses for these data sets as they become accessible. Even when the customer allows them to, typically under a green button, give you the right to be able to use this data as a third party. The entities that are getting that permission from the end use customer are not subjected to the same kinds of usage restrictions that the utilities that actually might have originally recorded that data as part of their meter data management process, bill generation, and the like. And who knows where those data sets go as a result of the agreements that, frequently, I'm guilty of this myself, you just click the button and it says, okay, because I want to get to whatever the thing that this person is offering me is. But if that actually involves releasing detailed information about my energy consumption that is then being applied in some other way, that is a potential mechanism for a large amount of re-identification. And if we look at the paradigm that is currently popular in many states, the 15-15 rule, where we say if you aggregate up to about 15 similar customers in a region, you're probably okay in terms of being able to keep that information relatively protected. We've done some work recently with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab through some Department of Energy cybersecurity work that has demonstrated the 15-15 rule is really not effective at preserving privacy. And these are the sorts of things that we need to be mindful of when we're thinking about access to and use of this data. It may not be the first use or even the second use, but what happens for these downstream uses becomes incredibly important, and in aggregate, these data sets can become very powerful. Now, that's personally identifiable information. I do want to point out, I do personally believe that there is a solution for this that's applying a framework of privacy preservation that is called differential privacy, which originally came out of a professor from Harvard, Cynthia Dwork, who originally developed this work around medical records information, but it's broadly applicable. These sorts of approaches have the ability to continue to preserve privacy over time, even in instances where this information would otherwise be made available. I think it's very important for both regulators and utilities to be mindful of that. Now, on the subject of critical energy infrastructure information, there are usually fairly straightforward rules about how this information is handled. The question is in the variability of the interpretation of those, which is again subject to both the legislature, the regulator, and the utilities interpretation thereof. And what we see is there is no single answer. These are all a question of interpretation. I will point out that making assessments about the trade-offs around that is actually quite complicated. Most state actors are not going to be using SoCal Edison or Con Ed's online maps for targeting infrastructure if that's what they want to do, right? They have their own eyes in the sky, and they're looking at this information, whether it shows up on an ARC server or in Google Maps is not really relevant to those entities. But it's important to understand that visual inspection is not the only way to see things. And so, especially when you're starting to deal with large proliferation of consumer devices, and when you deal with inverters or entities that are providing grid services, these are devices that spend a lot of time looking at the shape of the sine wave. And as you add more information to these data sets where the shape of the sine wave becomes apparent, you can actually rebuild the network without ever seeing the information geospatially. You could say, I see similar distortions in the shape of the sine wave, and I see voltage that follows a familiar pattern, tap changers moving as an example. And so it's important to understand that there are more eyes than just eyes in this equation, and yet we still need to recognize that there are regulations that we need to follow about access to the information. The last thing I want to say on this is it's also important as we think about more resources that will want to and have the ability to provide services to the utility or into the wholesale market, that if we are not careful about the kind of information we surface, that we can actually distort that market by providing information that would be what we would consider market sensitive data, right? And that is also important, because the last thing you want to do is create a situation where somebody identifies, I have market power in this area, and so I'm now going to charge not what my bid normally would be, but a bid that I believe I can get away with, because it ends up being that ratepayers pay more as a result of that.
Thank you, Airman. Thank you for bringing in the context of the market power. I know we're pretty well into this webinar, and I do want to I've got questions I know I could keep asking, but I would like to see if Matt Chester, if there are any questions in the chat that you'd like to have the panel address.
Absolutely, yeah, we've been getting some great questions in the chat, lots of activity here. I think the first one, Dan Garvey, if you're still around, I'd love to have you unmute your mic and ask your question. If not, I can ask for him. So the question he had submitted was, he pointed out that Paul highlighted that job one is safety and reliability. And so his question was, are you considering how AMI data can help support real-time grid operations in support of intraday analytics that can prevent operational disturbances and outages?
Yeah.
Question, who wants to take that? Damien, you got it?
Yeah, no, having just rolled out our AMI program, I have a plethora of examples. No, absolutely astute point. Yes, and yes. We've got one of our, aside from the obvious, right? We can now respond to storms just so much better because we actually know who's out. As prehistoric as it sounds, up until you have AMI, you're relying on calls and you're certainly making inferences, right? But so first and foremost, boom, got that. The next part is, we've been pushing like this conservation voltage optimization. And that it's that concept of grid edge, you know what I mean? Now you're on the grid edge. So you can take a little bit of slack that you have in the system and back it, you tend to run the voltage right at 126 volts, which is the absolute maximum at the substation. And so the people right there are getting acceptable but high voltage, and the people at the end tend to get lower voltage. So having the AMI in place allows you to, lower it to a point where you can see that everybody's still acceptable. And it's just like driving at 55, the cars are designed to be most efficient at 55, and when you go above it or below it, you're changing that, and then there's cool things we've done, like with the MTA, in terms of being able to sense, and share with them, give them more insight into their system when there's any kind of power issues with that. And then you can just see this just multiplying and multiplying. Our state estimator models are just going to be getting so much better. I'll give a plug for ARM. You start using that to see how customers are using the data. You start looking at, marketing to them. It'll help with demand response. It'll help you verify demand response, so it just goes further and further down the line. I will say, for the utilities, our engineers, the way we do it is we put them in charge of regions, and they not only design those parts of the system, but then when there's an operational event, they support the control center. So not all the time, but they're seeing the system, they're designing it, they know the as-built conditions, and then when there's an event unfolding, some kind of contingency event, they're supporting the control center. And so having the AMI tools makes them not just better at designing the system, but seeing how it works in a contingency case, and then taking that back. All right.
Damien, let me add on to something there that I think is, you said something at the end that is, I think, an important additional value. You made a reference to the engineer understanding the as-built system. Frequently during storm response, because of of the implications for getting customers back up as fast as possible, the as-built might not reflect the as-planned. And one of the things that's really valuable about AMI data is that you can actually drive insight into the as-repaired in a hurry to try to make sure people have reliable service. And that's actually a really additional sort of hidden value of a lot of this grid edge information that's out there, because you can start to see, in an effort to get this done as fast as possible, these line workers, you know, instead of putting it on phase A, put it on phase B, right? Like good to know that that happened. We can see that now, adjust our network models to reflect that, and reflect the as repaired as opposed to the as designed, which is ultimately going to reduce the amount of outages we have as measured by Katie, Sadie, and Safety. There's one more thing that I want to reference, the question about intraday information from AMI. I want to make sure people understand that there is a very large amount of data generated by these meters, and the backhaul and being able to get that data and confirm that it is clean and appropriate and as expected is not instantaneous. Now, there are mechanisms to address that. Kavala does a lot of AMI and SCADA cleaning and aggregation of known, what we refer to as sentinel systems, that do a good job of predicting the behavior of other systems that can speed up this process effectively into real time. But you can't just simply snap your fingers and say, give me all of the AMI data from the reading right now. Like the backhaul isn't designed to support that. It would be an overbuild of the system, and probably not the optimal use of ratepayer dollars. If you think about, like, I just want to be able to do everything no matter what all the time. Well, if that costs a lot more money, maybe that's not the highest and best use of those dollars.
Marco or Mark, anything to add, or I'll ask Matt for another question. Anything to add?
Only thing I would add is the fact that as we do continue to move forward with AMI, there's also grid edge computing associated with the AMI meters that we're having installed. So they'll be able to like self-heal aspects of the network in a much faster way, ultimately. But just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that was gonna be my, because we're now down to our journey where the first deployments of AMI is now life cycling out, and so now we're undergoing kind of a transition into the next generation of AMI, and the additional capabilities there. I think it's going to produce a lot more fruitful data. So we're kind of still thinking that through, and there'll probably be more to come in that space.
Thank you all. Matt, I'd like to give you an opportunity to pose another question from participants.
Absolutely. So this one comes from Hal Nelson. He asked, it's our understanding that most utilities have not, one, mapped individual meter service addresses to specific properties, and two, mapped those meters to specific electrical circuits. So he was asking if the panelists could describe their understanding of those two key analytical tasks.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where GIS, the geographical informational spatial system, whatever, I'm not getting that quite right, is key. And you're correct, there's a difference between just knowing that there's a meter in the vicinity, tying it to an address, and then tying it to a service. And it goes even further than that. For the gas system, it's actually really critical to know which side of the house the gas system's coming on. So to get all of that right. So, my understanding is we are doing that at Con Edison. It was part of when they put the meter in, they took a 3D GPS reading and tied it in there and tied it to the system. But this is where you start talking about data hygiene. So even when you have the processes in place and you do that, then there's got to be all sorts of quality assurance and things like that. So I don't want to ramble on too much, but hopefully that kind of at least gives you my perspective on that.
Yeah, and then from California side, it's very similar to what Damien mentioned there. I think we're in the same spot where we've deployed the AMI, we've understood the address, making sure it's kind of the data and the information is the accurate, complete, retrieval, verifiable, to make sure the quality there is something that I think all utilities are working towards being better at. And then on the connectivity side, I think Aaron hit the nail on the head on, like, as repairs. Sometimes some of those repairs may not be reflected in the as-builts, which causes some issues that I think we've all learned a lot over the last few years here, particularly with our detailed inspection program and understanding where things are mapped. And I think that's an ongoing activity that I think all utilities will continue to manage. But it's definitely something that we've designed it in there, and we're going to continue to improve upon it.
Yeah.
Marco, you look like you wanted something to add.
I was just going to add that the question about mapping the meter to the circuits, that's critical from our perspective in making the IEDR actually work. And I want to pose the question over to Damien. I think some of the utilities have embarked on that. I'm not sure if all of them in New York have every single meter mapped to a circuit, but I know that was a significant effort on the part of the utilities.
Yeah.
You know if Con Edison has completed that?
I believe we've completed that, Marco, and I think the other utilities are going for that, where it gets a little trickier just to talk it out. So yes, we know we got to do that. And then again, there's the coal quality data, and we're trying to get that right. And then I think where it comes up more is with the distributed energy resource in particular. When somebody puts solar on their roof, we know they intend to do it. At some point, we used to have to change out the meters and put a net metering. We don't have to do that with the AMI anymore. So that's a process improvement. But those are not always mapped to the circuit as well. They're associated to the address. Again, working on it, know where we got to get, and just being honest about some of the challenges. I've always said the utility business is not rocket science, but it's very, very, very complex. You know what I mean? We have 3.3 million customers, 44,000 of them have solar panels right now. We've got 240,000 boxes that hold our infrastructure. There's 96,000 miles of cable and splices, so just trying to let everybody know the gravity of it. So we're targeting 100%, but constant data quality, constant checking, constant GIS mapping is critical to that. And it also gives you a little bit of precursor why utility engineers think that way. We experience 1,000,001 events literally on a daily basis, just because there's millions of components and stuff happens like that. So we're constantly trying to drive. We want perfect. The only other piece, I used the wrong term, as built. There's, in addition to everything you guys very aptly described, there's the reality that, if something's happening in the street, even if it's salt melting into the manhole, things change in the structure, and getting the field engineer out there is even another piece. It's tracking what we do, adapting the maps as changes are physically made in the street, and then when you inspect a box or a pole or whatever, reflecting the as-built condition. That's what I actually meant. So there's all those layers. Just trying to, don't expect anyone to feel bad for a utility guy, just trying to show the complexity.
Thank you all. Man, how about one more question?
If I can add one.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
I want to sort of build on something Marco said here, right? Which is that it's really important to get these things right. You also heard that it's incredibly difficult to get these things right. So Kavala actually specializes in integrated analytics. And I think this is a really important point, that it's easier to get things right when you have multiple sort of layers of information that you are analyzing, right? If you only have 2 points, one says yes and one says no, you can't tell which one is right, right? If you get a third one, now you're starting to feel like, well, at least 2 of them agree. And as you add more, you gain more confidence in these things. And it is important to note, mistakes happen all of the time. And I'll just pick on meter IDs as an example. Meters move, right? Sometimes a meter is pulled off of one premise or premises and moved to another. And that record may not move at the same time for whatever reason. But if you start looking at the data associated with that meter in your MDMS system, and you look at, say, the voltage channel of that AMI record, you can start to say there's something off about this. Maybe we have an issue here, right? We see, especially in very large data sets, there are frequently errors that are introduced that repeat themselves for a period of time, and you have to go figure out like what happened as a result of, you know, maybe a software bug put the same address in, you know, multiple times. And like, well, we can't have 400,000 meters at the same street address unless it's our meter storage facility, right? So it's these sorts of things where you then have to go unpack and say, well, what are the steps that we can use to figure out what the system of record really should be? And we are, I think, Damien said this correctly, like we're dealing with millions of these devices, and anytime you're dealing with anything at that scale, there's going to be outliers, and there is always a strive to perfection, and it's also an absurd thing to try to expect to happen instantaneously.
Thank you, Aaron, for that follow-up. Matt, how about one more question from folks on the call?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you called on one more because I really wanted to get to this one. It's to the point from Kara Marshall. What should I read if I want to learn more about this topic?
I would suggest one of the things they read is the article on data democratization that one of our Resmo Row employees, Jason Price, had done. Matt, if you have the contact information, we'd be happy to send them that to start. I know, Cavallo, you've got information on your solution as well, which I think they'd find very helpful, and maybe even a demo. And then I'll leave it to the rest to see what you might add.
I'll give Marco a plug. You know, if you read the PFC white paper, honestly, the IEDR white paper, which was the precursor to this, you know, really lays everything out, and then the order follows that. But the white paper, I think, talks out the issues more. And then what's cool about this is a lot of this is evolving real time. But yeah.
Agreed. And I would also add that we had two white papers. One was on the integrated energy data resource, and the second one, which we released, I think, in parallel, and we can send the links, was dealing with data access framework, all the things related to privacy, cyber, and protections of data when an energy service entity wants to access the data. So they really go hand in hand.
So Mark, if we were to provide you with the citations or the links, would you be able to distribute that to the folks on the call?
Yeah, I think we can in the post replay have some links and resources available.
That'd be great, thank you. Any other interesting questions you'd like to ask Matt before we move on to another one?
I'd say why don't you move on with the panel?
Before Matt goes, I think there's a couple of things that I want to point out. Paul DeMartini and my colleague Laura Wang and I wrote a paper on grid data several years ago. It's still very valuable and valid in terms of sort of thinking about the framing of these issues. So that's currently GridWorks is the name of the organization. It was originally called More Than Smart, but it's a good source about grid infrastructure data, grid information as we sort of think about the smart grid as it evolves. And then there is going to be a report being released by the California Public Utilities Commission soon in the high DER proceeding. That's a pretty substantial report, and I strongly recommend people look into it. It is not yet released, so I can't point to it specifically, but it should be here in the not too distant future, and it will describe a lot of the it's an electrification impact study that looks at the entirety of the state of California at the address specific level. It combines econometric modeling at the address specific level and power flow for the entire state, and should be a very interesting document for folks to reference as we think about these issues, and more on that soon, I think.
Thanks, Chairman. You'll share that with Matt as well for him to send around. Quick question. It's a two-part question. First part, if you could describe how you would anticipate developers or third parties using the data that's available. Maybe give an example of a very high value use case. Second part of the question is, in your opinion, are the utilities as the distribution company being advantaged or disadvantaged by making this data available? And should they be compensated for it? So two-part question.
At a minimum, I'd like to take the first part, Paul, if that's okay.
Okay. That's fine.
And I definitely think it is the easier of the two. And then the developers, I think that's kind of the exciting thing. We haven't talked about non-energy use data, right? So it's really a combination of the both. And this is where you start to see the creativity come in, and you could see how a developer would tailor their offering to the customer, right? Now, I remember I did work for a code-gen developer for 3.5 years, so I know what the sales cycle is like. It's awfully tough. I really am sympathetic to it. So you take your hosting capacity maps, right? And then you take some non-utility data like empty rooftop space or brownfield sites, and you start stacking these different layers, and you start to say, oh, look at this. I've got somebody that lines up on all these levels, and I can go to that. Now that's, I'll give, there's a website out there. It's called Scenic Hudson. They've used the utilities. The utilities work with them and shared our hosting capacity maps. And then they've overlaid some cool things like this, like brownfield sites, farmland, and they're trying to, I think they're trying to advocate to use open, empty space and not clear-cut forests to put the solar in. I think that was their original mindset, and I think they've come up with an amazing solution. So I think that non-utility data is even more crucial to it. And again, you can see how you could get repetition, right? So I've talked about solar hosting capacity, but there's now EV, the utilities now have electric vehicle hosting capacity maps. So, maybe brownfield sites doesn't make sense for that, but maybe every university makes sense for that, where you might have a parking lot, or places where you could get public parking and stuff like that. Finding where the bus depots are, and addressing, everybody, the EV is super exciting, right? Driving a Tesla, right? But a third of the pollution comes from an extremely small fraction of the cars, these medium to heavy duty vehicles. So, again, I'm just trying to scratch at the surface of the million ways that having the energy data coupled with non-energy data could just create an outrageous amount of innovation.
Just a couple things there. I think medium and heavy duty is massive, right? It is where the vast majority of the particulate emissions that cause asthma come from. Mark's utility has, one of the largest, or the largest, depending on the year that we're in, ports out there. Just drayage infrastructure alone, moving things off of ports to distribution facilities, and then from those distribution facilities out to where they're ultimately consumed, or may roll into production, manufacturing, whatever it may be, is massive, right? That is a huge amount of load. I actually think that the electrification of transportation is going to represent the single largest challenge that we face as an industry, only exacerbated by electrification of buildings, right? And the thing that we're seeing now, and I think that this will become more apparent as these penetration levels increase, is that the planning horizons when distribution planning traditionally operates, and the planning horizons and how that distribution planning passes information onto the transmission planning process, is at real risk of missing the demand that comes very quickly as a result of beneficial electrification broadly, so both buildings and transportation. And when we think about how important it is to manage electrification of transportation and buildings as we decarbonize our economy, the last thing that we want to have happen is to have to wait to build transmission, which is a much longer planning time horizon than distribution solutions are. And so I think that what we are going to see, and this is not just at one or two utilities, but really everywhere, is a real need for utilities to be able to start thinking about how do we drive utilization of anything that we can to manage this gap until we get better at bridging the gap between distribution planning and transmission planning. Because nobody, I really do mean nobody, wants to see us just put the brakes on beneficial electrification for a period of time. Right now, we don't have really good mechanisms for seeing, should we start building transmission in area, A, B, or C, or 1, 2, or 3? because we're still new in this process, but it will absolutely be essential for us to start this process much sooner than we have historically been able to, because we've been managing a very, very slight increase in load for a very long time. And this is going to be of critical importance as we navigate decarbonization, especially over the next 10 years. Think about all those IRA dollars coming in, right? They have to be spent in this time period. And it would be incredibly unfortunate for those to be underutilized as a result of the fact that we have to wait for infrastructure solutions to come into place for that.
Anyone want to tackle the second part of the question? Utilities advantaged or disadvantaged, and should they be compensated for the data they make available? Certainly there's cost associated with getting the data to people.
I'll take it. I think utilities are advantaged. And I think that the commission, the New York Commission, actually recognized that by challenging the utilities to find ways that the IEDR could be beneficial to them. I mean, building on what Aram was saying in terms of planning for electrification, there's unlimited opportunities, I believe, when you have different types of databases together to enable utilities to do that. If they know where, they have to be planning where will EV chargers be located? Okay, let's start with where are existing gas stations? What are the patterns of customers that use EVs and driving patterns of people in general? All kinds of relationships that I believe the utilities should be thinking about, so they can be ahead of the curve in terms of being able to supply energy, to a highly electrified economy. Second one, should they be compensated for it? They're compensated for everything that they do, as a regulated utility. And the rate, for customer specific data, we've said customers own that data. Any usage data is mine and any customers. And in terms of being compensated, they are compensated for everything they do to enable their system. If it produces data that can then be beneficial to ratepayers, it should be made available for sure. Because what we are doing is ultimately beneficial to all ratepayers. Everybody that lives in New York. So it's not like one will benefit over another. We don't think so. We think that we're trying to produce benefits for everyone to enable the clean energy economy. So
I would argue people that live in New Jersey too, right? Because if you come in and charge your car in New York and then go home to New Jersey, I mean, there's a benefit there also. But I want to push back a little bit, Marco, on this point, which is that nobody I know fills up their gas tank at home, and nobody I know is envisioning a point in the future where they will empty their gas tank and sell it back to gas stations in the future. So it's a much more complicated process than simply finding where gas stations might be. I think one of the things that's really important to think about when we're designing programs and the like and around electrification and transportation, a demand response program for an electric vehicle probably needs to include some mechanism to ensure that electric vehicle that is being paid for, let's pretend, all sorts of values, including a distribution capacity value. You don't want that resource to go charge in another location at a different time and then increase the costs at that point in a way that potentially even more than offset the benefit that was associated with the demand response event in the first place. So we're going to need to start thinking much more about incorporating vehicle telematics and a more complicated version of MNV than we typically do for demand response programs or energy efficiency now.
Thank you. Mark, you were going to add something. Please go ahead.
Yeah. was just kind of following up what Marco was talking about too on that question that you had mentioned. So advantage or disadvantage, I think overall, I think it would be, an advantage for the entire economy. And I think the utilities serve that role to help out. So I think in the end, it should be an advantage for the utilities making such data available. But I think just wanted to highlight and continue to emphasize, making that data available does require a lot of extra effort that probably all the utilities are learning about, the cleansing and items there. And as Marco mentioned, that utilities should be recover those in rate cases, right? I think that the challenge that we see is that the request for data to be available, it's more data that's being requested to be available. And in fact, it's not just the data. It's actually a fair amount of analysis that is actually being requested when people are saying, hey, we want data. We can give you the data. But what you really want is that next level analysis, which there's always new things that are coming up. And I think in some of that analysis that drives the insights may not be entirely clear on the utility and why people want it. And it may, in our eyes, it might look like it's maybe a lower priority use case, but nonetheless, it's something that we're trying to make available. So I think when we say that, I think overall, the answer is yes. I think the utilities want to do this, but we also, there's so many use cases of data or analysis that results that the communities and customers want that it's almost kind of like a customized request that it comes forward. And so, as many times as we can standardize the data we can make available, I guarantee you that in a few months' time, there'll be, what about this? What about that? Can you make this available? And, it's something that I think the utilities have to continue to think about, and it's not going to come without a cost. We're going to have to continue to add to our rate case for the type of resource, the analysis, and systems to be able to keep up with that. So I just want to put that in perspective.
Thank you, Mark. We've got 8 minutes left. There's 4 panelists. I'd like to give you each 2 minutes to wrap up. You started with an opening comment. Based on the discussion we've had and the answers and responses to the questions, I'd like to give you each an opportunity to give a closing statement. And we'll go in the same order. We'll start with Mark, Aram, Marco, and Damien, and then we'll pass it back to Matt. Mark,
all right. I think I gave a little bit of my my closing statement, but I'll continue on there. So I think data and making sure that it's shared with other entities, I definitely agree that there's going to be high value for where we're going, particularly with a decarbonized economy. And we're going to need to be able to trade information to come up with the best grid that we can to meet all needs. I do think there's that dichotomy there between how much we share and the kind of the security aspect of it that I think we're all going to continue to learn and work around, and that having data make available for all uses, I think it's something that utilities are going to continue to work upon and really try to understand what's needed, and try to keep up with what the times there to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our customers.
I want to actually piggyback on something Mark said when he seeded his own closing comment there, which is there is a distinction between data, information, intelligence, and actionable intelligence, right? So we are in an environment where more and more data are becoming available, right? But you need context to be able to take that data and make it information, and you need to be able to apply strategy to that to make it intelligence, and then you need to understand what you can control to make it actionable intelligence. And we would do ourselves as an industry a disservice to predefine any of those things right now, because the needs will evolve and our understanding of them will evolve, and the ability to produce what we ultimately care about, which is actionable intelligence, is going to evolve as a result of that. And so it absolutely will require additional investments and additional value add analytics. Marco's work does that in one regard, and Mark and Damien's does it in another, right? There's more than one path to that, but in the end, we're trying to get to an evolution of an understanding of what it really takes to get to actionable intelligence.
So I want to focus my closing remarks on that. You know, we sit here and it's easy for us to talk about access to data and all the things that can be done with it, and it's easy for us to write a white paper that describes the end state that we want to get to. But it really takes the effort of a tremendous amount of people and dedicated individuals when it comes down to it, to making the outcome happen. And it will take a lot of time. It's not going to happen overnight. You know, AMI rollouts take years. To then say, I want to take all that data and put it in one place with all this other data, it's a very time-consuming and highly technical, highly resource-intensive effort that just want to leave that that experience. You know, we set out on this 3 years ago. I personally thought we'd be farther than we are today, but being in the weeds and understanding everything that has to really happen to enable it, really shine a light on it. It's a massive effort. It will take time, but you have to have that dedicated commitment and at least the vision to where you want to get to, you know, and start the journey. That's what I would leave.
It's not like online purchases. We order it today and it's here tomorrow.
No,
That's the way.
it doesn't come with the smiley on the box.
Thank you, Marco. Damien, you want to close us out?
Yeah, you know, I would just say, you know, what we're working on, I think we all agree is very important. And when there's that very important, you know, there's bound to be disagreements and stuff like that. But I really appreciate all of the panelists' point of view that, you know, there's got to be this deliberate approach and things like that. You know, and I think it's good that, you know, the utilities are made uncomfortable to try to share the data, that there's that dynamic, even though we're going to keep, you know, doing our argument. And I didn't talk much about central planning, but that is probably the one area with, you mentioned the threats, Paul. You know, the high school I went to, our motto was a sound mind and a sound body, you know, and Con Ed looks at it in a similar way with our planning. You know, the T&D system is the body, and we feel the benefit of a central mind planning that system. And we recognize the value of advanced forecasting and all this other stuff. And I'll just very quickly, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but when you look at our capital budget, you know, a significant portion of it is just responding to emergencies. A significant portion of it is like reliability work that goes to knowing the system. I mentioned, you know, our engineers each have regions. They work on specific networks. They plan the system. They get to see it enacted the next summer. That's the kind of cool thing about us. We go through another cycle of a peak load, and then we plan again. And when there's events, I mentioned that they go and physically support the control center, so they know that. You know, Con Ed's done work on global climate change. We're incorporating that into our procedures. There's obviously the integrated planning of the gas and steam systems, and to the extent that we're obviously retiring the gas system and trying to get off fossil fuels altogether, or converting them to clean hydrogen, there's that whole piece. So a little plug for the utilities. I know it. I know it is. And again, I'll just reiterate with the same first point. You know, we do take our commitment to the customer very, very, very seriously. We feel that we're the right people to use the data specifically for the planning of the system, and we recognize the imperatives that we have on a global scale to nonetheless really challenge ourselves to shake down every tree. And certainly democratizing the data, to use your term, is a critical part to doing that. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark, Aaron, Marco, and Damien for a I'll call it an outstanding webinar series and discussion of topics in depth. I'd also like to thank Energy Central for putting this all together for us. Thank you, Energy Central, Matt, and whoever else might be on the call. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Matt Chester, if there's anything you'd like to close with. We're at 3 minutes. We got 1 minute left, Matt.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to the rest of the panel, and also to West Monroe for sponsoring today's event. You can look for an email from us containing the replay, and please do take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide quality content. So thank you for attending, and this concludes today's presentation.
Thank you, panelists.